Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Little Orthodox Escaping Atheism series. This is chapter 4 in a series of impromptu live talks where we talk about the subject of the way the atheist movement lies about history, science, and other topics. The series is called Atheists Always Lie. This is installment number 4, where we're going to look briefly at the subject of atheists in history. Now, if you go on to the Max Kolbe channel, which is where this video is, you will look and see that we actually have a playlist, a 3-part playlist so far. This is going to be the 4th on the series. This series started with Atheists Always Lie about near-death experience, which is a specific area of science where we show and give many references to show that atheists lie when they say they've explained that away. In Atheists Always Lie number 2, we talked about how neurobiology and neuroscience supports current research in neuroscience supports the near-death experience stuff. And in chapter 3 of Atheists Always Lie, we talked about physics, biochemistry, and even evolution, although we will probably be revisiting the evolution topic, because whether you are even interested in the creationist versus evolutionist debate, in reality, you're going to find that ideological atheists even mess with evolutionary science and don't give us all the available information on that, and often give us bad information. So I hope you continue to enjoy this series. Please give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. We could use your financial assistance. Please visit us on our funding vehicles. We really appreciate that. I'll show you here on the Max Kolbe channel. Again, here's where you can find the playlists on the Max Kolbe channel, and here's the Atheist Always Lie playlist. I'm going to give you now today, we're going to talk about the subject of history, because again, I'm going to repeat, we know that not all atheists are like that. We know that there's the natural atheist who just has a hard time believing in God. But atheism today is a hate movement. It's an organized political, social, and religious cult movement. And some of its biggest figures are the likes of Richard Dawkins and the late not so great Christopher Hitchens. Even bigger names like Steven Pinker, Michael Shermer, and quite a few others like that can be shown time and time again to be intensely ideological. Now, as we showed in the first three segments, they do lie about science a lot, and we will be revisiting in future episodes other areas of science where ideological atheists lie. But let's talk about the subject of history, because there's probably no area they lie more about except maybe science, and that would be history. Atheism runs today on a narrative. It is a Marxist narrative, whether those who follow and believe in the narrative are aware of it or not. It's all directly traceable in multiple ways to something called the League of the Militant Godless, run by Stalin, which was a militant atheist group. Much of what appears in the writings of people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris comes straight out of it. In fact, it's even been shown that Christopher Hitchens plagiarized materials from the old Soviet League of the Militant Godless word for word in his book, God is Not Great. And that is where we get to the problem. Starting in the 19th century especially, although you can find traces of this going back to the French Revolution, it's been popular for Marxists, with some idiots who aren't Marxists who just believe the Marxist party line. And that narrative goes something like this, that people used to be primitive and not understand things like evidence and rationality, and then science came along, and science taught us how to be logical and look for evidence of things and to be able to falsify things and prove them. And slowly over time, we pulled away from our primitive religious superstitions, and the big bad institutional church that was finally free after all the persecution of people like Galileo and Giordano Bruno and all these horribly oppressed scientists. My God, we couldn't do even stem cell research in the early 2000s because of those horrible Christians. And it's all narrative. It's all fake, phony history. Fake, phony history to go along with their fake science, saying, you know, that science has proven there's no need for God, and has, you know, pushed the idea of God further back as science has explained more. It's all garbage. in reality, if you're in the Western world, you owe anything you love in science to Christianity, and you probably owe it to, more than anything else, to the organized institutional church. Now, someone's going to be accuse me of being too pro-Catholic here, but let me make clear that the contributions of non-Catholics has been enormous over the centuries, especially since the Reformation. But it is a fact, not an opinion, that in all of Europe, the entire education system, starting with the universities, but also branching down into lower levels, into what we, would now call grade school, that was all a Christian project. In fact, the whole idea of universal literacy as a goal was a Christian project. And most of it happened in Europe before the Protestant Revolution, so that we can say until the Protestant, the Reformation came along, there was only one church to speak of. And that was what we would call the Catholic Church today, or the Roman Catholic Church. Subsequent to that, though, however, Lutherans and Anglicans and others went on to found schools and universities too, and kept part of that historic Christian mission. The reality is that Christians were pro-science from the very beginning. They were pro-science during the days when they were underground, and they had philosophers like Justin Martyr and Polycarp arguing in favor of Christianity. They were pro-science in the days of St. Augustine, and after the religion became legal and then became the official Roman religion, the church was still pro-science. You'll hear lying atheists will tell you that the church made it illegal to operate on cadavers to learn about the human body, and that's a total lie. That's a total fabrication. You hear lies about Galileo. You hear lies about all sorts of things. Let's have a look at some books that you can pick up to learn a little more about history. A good one to look at is God's Philosophers, How the Medieval World Laid the Foundations of Modern Science by James Hannam. This all goes into well before the Protestant Revolution, well before even the Enlightenment or the Renaissance or any of those eras of history, and goes on to and goes back into the so-called Dark Ages. You will hear people strangely speaking of an era of the Dark Ages. Some even have invented this mythological Christian Dark Ages, they call it. And in reality, it turns out that there was never any real Dark Ages. The Dark Ages was a phrase that historians used to use maybe about 100 years ago, maybe even 75 years ago. You could still see historians using that term seriously, maybe. But they were only called the Dark Ages because people didn't have not a lot of writing survived from the era that historians were aware of. There was a problem that the Roman Empire broke up. Some might blame Christianity for that, and we can have a talk about that sometime, but the Roman Empire broke up, and what it did is it dissolved into many different languages and written traditions. And so in reality, the empire was falling apart, and everybody recognized that the empire was falling apart. And what actually happened is that the Christians, the Christian leaders, the bishops of the time, and yes, the Pope at the time, there's always been a Pope there in that Vatican since Constantine's days and earlier, said that the best thing to do was to educate people. If we wanted to bring peace to what is now Europe, and somehow bring back the good old days of the Roman Empire, which most people thought they were good old days, the Christians decided literally that educating everybody was the best way of doing that. Spreading literacy, mathematics, philosophy, science, music, spreading those became a central core Christian mission. You'll find the Dominicans, Augustinians, and quite a few other orders of medieval monks that have been around since the medieval days. They're still around today. We're some of the greatest educators in human history. And the entire background of experimenting on science and publishing your work and having a system where your peers would review your work, i.e. peer review, all invented by the church. And while it's very interesting that you can sit there and say, well, yes, but what about all those times the church got in the way of science? Well, most of those are well known, but you're talking about embarrassing incidents that happened over a period of, well over 1,000 years of steady development of the sciences and philosophies before any Enlightenment and before any Reformation. It was all going on. It was all a church project to begin with, because wealthy noblemen were more interested in war and commerce. It was the church that said we need to invest in universities and education. So on multiple levels, it's wrong to sit here and talk about the Christians especially as anti-education. We'll also go ahead and mention in other religions. I hate mentioning the religion of Islam, but you cannot take away the fact that within their religion, they did have schools, they did have education, they did have developments in math, they did make contributions during that era. And by the way, the Christians like Thomas Aquinas did read the Muslim scholars because they got things out of them. And they also read things like the Jewish scholars. The Jews had a really strong intellectual tradition. The Orthodox Jews still do. The religious ones, the ones who believe in God, have a strong respect for the science and no problem with science, except when occasional moral error issues come up. And this is true of other religions as well. The entire narrative, this is phony narrative, is that religion's been at war with science all this time, or that religion is a substitute for science, or science is a substitute for religion. And it's garbage. The study of science flowed naturally out of the religion, especially an idea that there is a God. Now, again, this has been true for thousands of years and isn't just Christians. It isn't specific to one religion. But the whole idea of God was that something is making the universe go this way, and something put us here. And at least within the so-called Abrahamic traditions, most seem to agree that with the exception of a few moral prohibitions here and there, like, you don't kill people just to do scientific experiments on them and certain other things, all the big Abrahamic faiths have always been fairly science-friendly. And again, the Christians especially are noted for sponsoring and paying for a lot of it and for educating a ton of scientists. So when you go through history, you can't just paint it as good. Look through 2,000 histories and find some embarrassing incidents where religious people and science conflicted. In reality, the conflict has always been rare and usually acknowledged when people got it wrong. Another good one to look at in that regard is called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion by Ronald L. Numbers. And this will educate you on why you've been lied to about Galileo, why you've been lied to about Columbus, why you've been lied to even about the Inquisitions, which, by the way, the Great Inquisitions, they did have embarrassing things, but they're still not as horrible as people make them out to be. And you can make anything out. I mean, the Spanish Inquisition went on for 400 years, and mostly it did get bad people. And by the way, most people were immune to the Inquisitions unless they were actually clergy or working officially for the church in some capacity. That was how you got the Inquisition's attention in the first place. We can go on and on and on about this, but the fact is that if you just read Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion, probably 90% of what you thought you knew about science and religion, especially the Christian religion, will just be completely debunked for you, and you'll be a lot smarter. And you can stop being, if you're Christian, you can stop being embarrassed. And if you're not Christian, you can stop feeling superior, or you can stop feeling like you can just crap on your Christian friends. If you're committed to knowing the truth, there's no reason to keep spreading lies about history, about the relationship of Christianity with society, or the relationship of religion with society, and science or other aspects. Another one to mention, just because it's been mentioned so many times before, you've seen this guy's work, you've seen this guy interviewed on Stefan Molyneux's channel, you've probably seen him other places. Thomas Woods wrote How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. I'm going to mention again, this may seem like a specific defense of the Roman Catholic Church, but in reality, if you're going to look at Christianity in Europe, then for about 1,000 years until about the Reformation, the Church and the Catholic Church, the Christianity and the Catholic Church, were pretty much synonymous in Europe. And it was the Catholic Church that built so much of Western civilization. Now, after the Reformation came along, we have to be honest, if we just looking at the issue of institutional education and science, again, I'll say, you know, in a big sense, the Anglicans and the Lutherans are part of the Catholic Church in that sense. Speaking more broadly, liberally, the word Catholic actually just means universal. And so the universal church, if we're going to be a little bit liberal in our phrasing, we'll say within how the Catholic Church built civilization, we would say how the Catholic Church, including the Protestants, because the Protestants made good, big contributions. Copernicus, for example, I believe, no, was it Copernicus or was it, no, Copernicus was Catholic. Kepler, the great Kepler, Johann Kepler, was a Protestant, although he worked at a Catholic university, and he knew Galileo and people like that. In fact, there's one of the stories about Galileo you don't know, which is that they were all doing their work in church institutions. Oh, and Galileo had all but demanded that the church take a position on a scientific question. That the church didn't want to. The church didn't actually want to weigh in on the question of whether or not the earth went around the sun. But Galileo demanded it in a lot of ways and pulled help from an old friend who later became the Pope. In any case, again, to get back to how the Catholic Church built Western civilization, it was pretty neat. I had my 19-year-old son read this, and he really liked it. And he did mention the one thing that's funny, though. And the MGTOW on YouTube would appreciate this if they saw it. He read it and he said, you know, you could almost just change that to how monks built Western civilization. And that is absolutely correct. Young men in monasteries, well, men of all ages in monasteries, built much of European civilization, including the university system and most of science. They really, really did. Now, the fact of the matter is that, you know, people sit there and they say atheism is not an ideology and blah, blah, blah. And you know what? For the natural atheist who just kind of decided that on his own, fine. But again, we've got to get back to the fact that atheism is an organized movement now. More and more people recognize it, including atheists themselves. And they profit a lot from lying about religion. Now, they lie about religions other than Christianity, of course, but it's clear they lie about Christianity the most, at least here in the English-speaking world. So again, I suggest reading something to debunk these common claims you hear about religion. Even if you don't turn religious, learn something so you're not ignorant on the matter. Now, to get back to the idea that atheism is, in fact, very much a movement, I'm going to recommend a couple of books so that you can stop arguing with me about this. The most important book I recommend is this one called The New Atheist Denial of History by Borden W. Painter. Do whatever you have to do to get a copy of this book. It was overpriced over the objections of the author. It had a horrible cover and not a very good title, also over the objections of the author. It was never sent out properly for reviews, also over the objections of the author. In other words, this publisher, an academic publisher, did everything it could to destroy this book. And this book is written by a retired professor of history who used to be the president of Trinity College, was professor of history at Trinity College before that. That's one of the Ivy League liberal arts colleges, one of the most prestigious in the U.S. and the world, Trinity College. He was its president. Before that, he chaired its history department. He now has a history chair in his name at Trinity College. He's got a CV a mile long. You can find that on the escapingatheism.com, by the way. He's one of the most published peer and respected in the peer-reviewed historical journals. And in this book, he completely destroys Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Steven Pinker, Michael Shermer, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, who am I missing? Oh yes, Christopher Hitchens. All of these people get raked over the coals for their phony history. I'm going to repeat, for phony history. Not just for little errors either, but big ones. And big ones involving collusion, where they quote each other making dodgy claims and quote to make themselves look smarter, you know, more credible than they are, and where they also use completely non-credible sources, and they quote the non-credible sources properly, but then they'll take they'll also use credible sources. All of these men I just named, all of these big name atheists I just named, they'll use credible sources, but will distort those credible sources to say things the authors never intended to say. every big name atheist I just mentioned is found guilty of that, and this would survive in any court, even UK libel court. Would survive Canadian libel court. It would easily survive American libel court. This book was buried. This book was buried by its publishers. And he shows how all these people are colluding, and in fact collude very much like Holocaust deniers. And by Holocaust deniers, I don't mean those of you who are out there who are saying, yes, it's okay to question some of the numbers or some of the stories. Yes, of course. Even Borden Painter acknowledged it's okay to ask historic questions and see if we got the history wrong. But only radical extremists really denied that any Holocaust happened. I mean, really. And he shows how these people, these big names, use the exact same dodgy historical methodologies as Holocaust deniers and other people who just, you can't trust their work. And these people work in collusion with each other, and they're all forwarding the same anti-religious message. Painter also calls every single one of them out for denying the reality of repression of religion, which has been a constant for centuries, both in the 21st century, where religious people by the millions were persecuted just for being religious by atheist regimes, by statist regimes. He calls out Steven Pinker in particular for just lying about that. This is a heck of a book, and the source is unimpeachable. Another one to look at is The New Atheist Threat, The Dangerous Rise of Secular Extremists. Now, I keep missing CJ, but he promises to come and do an interview with me sometime. This book, first off, CJ is himself an atheist and still is last I looked, and he does it professionally with a group of other atheists. So he's worked with and is familiar with atheists like Godsod and Sam Harris and the people over at Secular Talk. He knows all those people. He's worked with those people. And he himself has written this book, The New Atheist Threat, The Rise of Secular Extremists. Now, what's really funny about this book, too, is right in his own introduction, he predicts that this book will be subjected to a bunch of panned reviews on places like Amazon and Goodreads, and it's absolutely true. You will see, if you look through the reviews, there's a bunch of butthurt, angry atheists who hate C.J. Werleman for what he's written, but they don't actually refute anything he's got written in this book. New Atheist, the Atheist Network that people like Harris and Dawkins and all those people were part of, it's a cult network. It's a ring. It's a racket. Their opinions are for sale to the highest bidder. Will skeptic for cash. Now, CJ, I will warn you, is an excessive apologist for Islam. I'm one of those people who doesn't like it when people lie about Islam by making it more evil than it is, or just by making it more, making up things about Islam that I just know aren't true. But I find that as annoying as people who just praise it fulsomely and can say nothing good about it and deny any bad in it. And CJ falls a little more in the denies a little too much bad in it camp. He's much too much of an Islam apologist, but he's not wrong in everything he says. And in any case, whether you're interested in that debate or not, look at what he's saying about this network of atheists he works with. Guys, it's a cult network, and it's a for cash profitable network. And these people lie a lot, and they are frequently dangerous extremists. If you want to know a little bit more about about Borden Painter, please go to the old Escaping Atheism channel. I probably will duplicate this at some point on the Max Kolbe channel, but we have a 3-part interview with Professor Painter. Just go into the old Escaping Atheism channel, search for Borden Painter. It's a 3-part interview, and it's a knockout interview. And you'll hear this man talk, and he's so mild-mannered, and he's so intelligent, and the impact of what he's saying hardly hits you because he's just that strong as an academic, and he's so mild-mannered. But he really does lay out how all these atheists, these big-name popular atheists, lie about history, and not in little ways, in big ways. They lie about the 20th century. They lie about the previous 3-4 centuries. Those are what Painter concentrates on. So I do recommend his book, in addition to books like God's Philosophers, Galileo Goes to Jail, How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. In reality, these should show you that atheists just plain lie about history. Sometimes they fabricate things completely, like most of what you've been told about Galileo is fabricated. Sometimes they get it right, but they're lopsided and one-sided, so that that they will point to something like the Inquisitions, where everybody, including the Christians, agrees that bad things that were not excusable happened, but not bothering to note that the secular state and secular governments were far more bloody and far more intolerant. The fact of the matter is, atheists lie about history. They tell you religion is dangerous. They tell you it is irrational. They tell you it is not evidence-based, and that it makes people crazy and makes them go to war. And it's simply garbage. It's pseudoscience and it's pseudo-history. And remember that, by the way, when you read fakers like Steven Pinker, who wrote this ridiculous book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, was Why Violence Has Declined. Pinker is trying to make it out that getting away from religion and becoming more scientific and more secular makes people simply less violent. And as Borden Painter points out, he's making crap up, and he's ignoring and erasing the history of state repression of religion and religious people, which is some of the most murderous, violent behavior in history. Similarly, again, I'll get more Michael Shermer. Always laugh at an atheist when he tries to talk to you about morality. Here's one by Michael Shermer, The Morals Arc, How Science Makes Us Better People. Another man who simply denies the history, erases the history of so-called scientific rationalists who butchered in the name of their scientific rationalism. We're talking millions of people, and people like Shermer and Pinker don't even want to talk about it. So, all right, remember, kids, atheists don't just lie about contemporary science, but they do. They lie about cosmology, they lie about neurobiology, they will lie about near-death experiences, they lie even about evolution. They have a narrative, a set of tales they've spun for you. And the question is, should you believe them, or should you start getting skeptical of them? Remember, if an atheist is making a claim about history or about science, remember, get skeptical of what they're saying and challenge them on it. And if they get mad, say, what? I'm just being skeptical. Shouldn't we learn skepticism? Yeah, remember to be real skeptical of atheists, especially when they're talking about science or history. Okay, everybody, please give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. We will see you tomorrow night.